If you need to work with URLs, especially if you need to parse URL, Node has this URL module that you can use. It has many methods, but the most important one is parse. The format method is also useful. So let me show you how to work with that. Before we do, let's take a look at the URL API documentation from the nodejs.org website. This diagram here has details on all the elements of a URL. This example is manually parsing this URL in here. So you can see we have the protocol, which is HTTP. There is the authentication part, which is username and password in case we have those. Then there's hostname and port, and both of them together is a host. Then there's the path name, which is what comes after the host and before the query string. And then with a query string, the question mark including the query itself, we call it search. But without the question mark, we call it query. And path name plus search is called path. And if we have a hash location here, it will be called hash. These are all the elements in any URL object. So if we have the URL as a string and we need to parse it into those elements, we can use the URL parse method. For example, I can use the URL.parse method to parse this URL that I just grabbed from Pluralsight search. And this call is going to give me all the elements that I have in that URL. We have an HTTPS protocol. We don't have any authentication data. The host is pluralsight.com. And since the port is null, the host and hostname is the same. There's no hash. There's a search part, query part, path name, path, and the href itself, which is the full URL. We can actually also specify a second argument here, true, to parse the query string itself. So if we do that, the query string will be parsed. And reading information from the query string is as easy as doing .query.q, for example. This will give me exactly the search query for that URL. If, on the other hand, you have the inverse situation, if you have an object with all these elements detailed and you want to format this object into a URL, you can use the URL.format method. And this will give you back a string with all these URL object properties concatenated in the right way. If you only care about the query string, then you can use the query string module, which has many methods as you see, but the most important ones are the parse method and the stringify method. So if we have an object like this one, and we want to convert this object into a query string portion, all we need to do is call query string.stringify on that object, and it will give me an actual string I can use in any URL query. And you can see how this stringify method escaped some special characters by default, which is great. If you have the inverse situation, if you have a query string and you want to parse it into an object, what you need here is query string.parse, and you give it the string that you want to parse, and this will give you back an object parsed from that query string.